talk to me a little bit about carbon taxes, which is, again, I guess is probably the other one that's kind of most common, at least from what I've seen in terms of policy design. Perhaps it's a little bit intuitive. I imagine, just kind of slapping a tax on certain things. But talk to me a little bit about the incorporation and use of carbon taxes or other types of taxes, depending on what the actual pollutant or degradation, negative externality is, how they're designed and their kind of relative effectiveness.
So carbon taxes are in one sense simple because, as you've already said, the kind of marginal impact of one extra ton of carbon emitted doesn't really depend on where it was emitted or by whom or how it was produced. We value one less ton of emissions in Australia exactly the same as we value one less ton of emissions in Norway, because they essentially are just all contributing to global climate change. So that kind of makes it simpler. And if you do impose a carbon tax kind of a very high level, so, let's say at the level of the production of oil, for example, the refining of oil, then that does kind of bounce through every layer of production and every consumption decision, which has a bearing on final emissions. So in a sense, it's hard to escape the effects of a carbon tax if you levy it at the right point in the system. But what makes carbon taxation more tricky is you have to think about the fact that one more ton emitted today doesn't just have an impact today, it has an impact which goes through time for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so you've got to think about that when you're setting the tax. And what you've also got to think about is the fact that as the total stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere goes up, then the marginal impact of one more ton is also changing. What that kind of implies is that carbon taxes should be rising over time. But it's pretty ferociously difficult to calculate exactly by how much and in what way. But certainly they should be going up. So I think carbon taxes is something that seems really simple, but actually because of this dynamic stock effect is actually slightly more complicated. To give you a kind of the polar opposite, again, coming back to the state of many English rivers and lakes, if we think that their poor ecological status is often caused by too high a nutrient level, and where are those nutrients coming from? Well, they're coming from fertilizers and from livestock. Okay, so why don't we just put a tax on that? Well, first of all, we don't observe the emissions. So, we observe farmers growing wheat, and we maybe observe how many tons of fertilizer they add, but we don't actually observe what's seeping out into rivers and lakes. Say, well, okay, that's fine. Let's just put the pollution tax on the fertilizer then, or let's put the pollution tax per head of cow. But then you say, well, hold on a minute, because actually we know there's big spatial variation in the impact of one more kilogram of fertilizer depending on where it's applied, and even when it's applied. And also, how are we going to monitor how much fertilizer farmers end up applying? How many farmers are there in Britain? It's quite a few. So I think that gives you some other ideas of the complications in using pollution taxes.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to that concentration in that issue, because obviously, to your point, particularly, I think my general understanding about kind of water pollution for oxygen levels and some other things as well, it's usually there's like a tipping point where, if X amount of something gets into the water, then it becomes very sort of degrading for fish and various other wildlife forces. And if you do have this kind of general tax sort of across the nation, obviously there are bigger farms in some areas. There are different types of farms in different areas that may use less fertilizer or more fertilizer. There may be regions where there's more rivers where it can sort of soak up more of the runoff a little bit more than others compared to others. And so to your kind of the point we made earlier, anytime you have that instance, it's going to be very difficult to administer in an appropriate manner, as compared to just a general carbon emissions tax, for example, because it kind of affects everywhere, sort of every point on the globe, at least relatively the same point, which I imagine is obviously, again, just like a very, very difficult thing to be able to administer.
Yeah, I mean, think about applying a greenhouse gas emissions tax to livestock. That's a real challenge in how you would design that. If you think about how, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the livestock industry, you'd have to say, well, I'm not sure exactly how. Is it just a sort of headage tax per head of cattle or per head of sheep? I'm not sure. And of course, as economists, we tend to focus on just minimizing the cost per unit reduction in pollution. But you might say, well, actually, politicians also worry about what that does to food prices, or what that does to the difference between rural incomes and urban incomes, a whole bunch of other stuff that we tend to not think about very much.
Yeah, certainly. And in terms of actual incentive design, because as we kind of mentioned, when we're trying to design a lot of these policies, like obviously incentives come into it and factor into it. How do you design policy in a way that draws upon the appropriate incentives, and instead of accidentally creating perverse ones that may, when I think about this isn't like an environmental economics example, but I remember not too long ago we were talking about the economic history of India. And I remember that there was this, during the British Raj, they wanted to get rid of like rattlesnakes for particular regions. And so what they did is they created a scheme where, locals can basically kill rattlesnakes, take off their tails, give them into individuals, and basically get like a fee. And for a very short period of time that worked. But as time went on, they were paying out more and more money into it. And what they realized is people were actually just creating rattlesnake farms and then cutting them off and then selling them to the government. And so they actually weren't solving the problem. They were actually making the situation worse, because there's suddenly these rattlesnakes farms and they're kind of everywhere. And I know that's not necessarily, I suppose it's a little bit of an ecological one, but like that's not a direct one into the environmental policy. But I think that's an example, at least for me, as like a clear example of, you've created a policy on paper that would work, but obviously in its implementation, it's kind of created these kind of perverse incentives that have not only mitigated the outcome you're trying to achieve, but potentially even made it worse.